Television broadcasting occasionally produces moments of such profound authenticity that the carefully maintained boundary between entertainment and genuine human experience dissolves completely, allowing viewers to witness transformative acts of courage that demonstrate why truth-telling remains essential to human dignity and relational integrity regardless of the personal cost involved. On a Wednesday afternoon in October 2024, Family Feud was conducting what production personnel anticipated would be a routine recording session, featuring two families engaged in the competitive format that had sustained the program's popularity across multiple generations of American viewers who had come to appreciate the show's combination of lighthearted entertainment and genuine family interaction. The studio environment maintained its characteristic energy and professional atmosphere. Technical staff executed their established responsibilities with practiced competence, and Steve Harvey prepared to facilitate the proceedings with the combination of humor and authentic interpersonal engagement that had distinguished his tenure as the program's host and had created meaningful connections with countless contestants who had appeared on the show during his many years in this role. However, one contestant was carrying knowledge of personal circumstances so significant and emotionally complex that when she finally summoned the courage to disclose the truth she had been concealing for more than 3 decades, her revelation would stop production entirely, move Steve Harvey and the studio audience to tears, and ultimately demonstrate that living authentically requires the courage to speak truths that others may find difficult to understand or accept, but that must be spoken if one is to achieve the integration of public presentation and private reality that constitutes genuine personal integrity. What transpired during those extraordinary minutes proved that the decision to live honestly, even when that honesty contradicts narratives one has maintained for decades, and even when speaking truth risks relationships one values deeply, represents one of the most significant choices human beings make, and one that profoundly affects not only the individual making that choice, but also all the relationships and communities that individual inhabits. If you value authentic demonstrations of personal courage, the importance of truth-telling even when circumstances make such honesty difficult, and the transformative power of finally living in alignment with one's genuine identity after years of concealment, please take a moment to support this channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to receive future content. The narrative you are about to experience illustrates why personal authenticity, while often requiring difficult conversations and while potentially disrupting established patterns and relationships, ultimately serves both individual well-being and relational integrity more effectively than continued concealment ever can. Katherine Brennan was 62 years old and had spent the previous 38 years maintaining a presentation of herself to the world that was fundamentally inconsistent with her internal experience of her own identity and her understanding of who she truly was. The carefully constructed persona she had developed during early adulthood and had maintained through decades of marriage, parenting, and professional activity. She resided in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she had established herself as a successful real estate agent with a strong reputation for competence, integrity, and genuine concern for her clients' needs and interests. To external observers who knew Katherine in her professional capacity or through her community involvements, she represented the embodiment of conventional success and respectability. She maintained an extensive professional network, participated actively in various civic and charitable organizations, and presented herself as someone who had navigated life's challenges with grace and had built a life characterized by stability, achievement, and appropriate fulfillment of social expectations and family obligations. However, beneath that carefully maintained exterior existed a woman who had been living with profound disconnection between her public presentation and her private reality, a disconnection that had required constant vigilance and emotional management across nearly 4 decades and that had exacted costs in terms of psychological well-being and authentic relational connection that Katherine was only beginning to fully acknowledge and understand. Katherine had grown up in a conservative, religiously observant family in a small town in rural Minnesota during the 1960s and early 1970s. Her father had worked as a banker, while her mother had managed household responsibilities and had been deeply involved in their church community, which served as the center of the family's social life and which provided the moral and behavioral framework within which Katherine and her siblings had been raised. The family's religious tradition emphasized conventional gender roles, traditional family structures, and adherence to moral teachings that left little room for deviation from established norms regarding sexuality, marriage, and appropriate life trajectories for men and women. Katherine had absorbed these values and expectations deeply during her formative years, understanding implicitly that certain aspects of personal identity or desire were simply incompatible with the life her family and community considered acceptable, and that acknowledging such incompatibilities would result in rejection, judgment, and potential exclusion from the relationships and community that provided her sense of belonging and security. During her adolescence and young adulthood, Katherine had become increasingly aware of feelings and attractions that did not align with the heterosexual orientation her family and community assumed she possessed, and that religious teachings identified as morally problematic. Katherine experienced romantic and physical attraction to other women rather than to men, a reality that created profound internal conflict given the religious and cultural context within which she was attempting to understand herself and to plan for her future. She recognized that acknowledging her sexual orientation openly would likely result in family rejection, social ostracism, and potential loss of the educational and professional opportunities she was hoping to pursue. The early 1980s offered limited cultural support for young people questioning their sexual orientation, particularly in conservative religious communities where homosexuality was understood as sinful choice rather than as an inherent aspect of personal identity. Katherine made a decision during her early 20s that would shape the next 4 decades of her life. She determined that she would not acknowledge her sexual orientation to her family or to her broader community, and that she would instead pursue the conventional life trajectory expected of women in her social context: marriage to a man, children, establishment of a household that conformed to traditional family structures. Katherine believed at the time that this decision represented the only viable path forward if she wanted to maintain relationships with her family and to avoid the social and professional consequences she feared would result from living openly as a lesbian. She also internalized messages from her religious tradition suggesting that her attractions to women were temptations to be resisted, rather than fundamental aspects of her identity to be acknowledged and integrated. Katherine met her future husband Michael during her senior year of college. Michael was a decent man who came from a similar religious and cultural background and who was pursuing a career in accounting. The relationship developed in ways that Katherine could recognize intellectually as appropriate and functional, even though she did not experience the romantic or physical attraction to Michael that she understood other women felt toward their male partners. Katherine convinced herself that this absence of attraction was acceptable, that marriage should be based on shared values and practical compatibility rather than on feelings she believed to be unreliable and potentially problematic, and that she could build a satisfactory life with Michael despite the lack of genuine romantic connection. They married when Katherine was 24 years old. Katherine approached the marriage with determined commitment to making the relationship work and to fulfilling the role of wife and eventually mother in ways that would satisfy social expectations and that would create the appearance of normalcy regardless of her internal experience. The early years of marriage were characterized by Katherine's consistent effort to perform the behaviors and emotional responses she believed appropriate for wives, while simultaneously managing the disconnection between her external presentation and her internal reality. Michael appeared satisfied with the relationship and did not seem to notice or question Katherine's lack of genuine enthusiasm for physical intimacy or her somewhat detached emotional engagement with aspects of married life that other wives apparently found fulfilling. Katherine gave birth to their daughter Sarah when she was 27 years old, followed by their son Matthew 3 years later. Katherine approached motherhood with genuine commitment and found that parenting provided meaning and purpose that her marriage had not delivered. She loved her children deeply and invested herself fully in creating a stable, nurturing home environment that would support their development. The demands of raising 2 children also provided socially acceptable explanations for reduced intimacy in her marriage with Michael and for the emotional energy she directed toward her children rather than toward her husband. Katherine established her real estate career during the years when Sarah and Matthew were young, building a successful practice that provided both financial contribution to the household and professional identity that extended beyond her roles as wife and mother. She discovered that she possessed natural aptitude for the interpersonal and practical aspects of real estate transactions, and that professional success created opportunities for recognition and achievement that partially compensated for the absence of genuine fulfillment in her personal life. Michael's accounting career likewise progressed steadily, and the family achieved comfortable middle-class stability that appeared from external observation to represent successful navigation of adult responsibilities and appropriate life development. However, throughout these years of marriage and parenting, Katherine continued to experience attractions to women and to recognize that her internal sense of identity and desire remained fundamentally misaligned with the life she was living. She did not pursue romantic or sexual relationships with women, maintaining strict fidelity to her marriage vows, even as she acknowledged privately that her commitment to the marriage was based more on obligation and fear of consequences than on genuine romantic attachment to Michael. Katherine managed these internal tensions through determined focus on practical responsibilities, through immersion in work and parenting activities that provided distraction from uncomfortable self-reflection, and through periodic attempts to convince herself that what she was experiencing was normal, and that all married people felt some level of disconnect between their public presentation and their private feelings. The situation continued in this fashion through Sarah and Matthew's childhoods and adolescence. Katherine maintained her marriage, raised her children with attention and care, built her professional reputation, and presented to the world an image of conventional success and appropriate adult functioning. Her family remained unaware of her internal struggles and her ongoing recognition that she was living a life fundamentally inconsistent with her authentic identity. Michael appeared satisfied with their marriage, though Katherine suspected that he might recognize at some level that their relationship lacked the depth and passion that characterize truly connected partnerships. However, Michael did not initiate conversations about these potential deficits, and Katherine did not volunteer information that would require her to acknowledge truths she had been concealing for decades. The catalyst for change emerged approximately 5 years before the Family Feud taping, when Katherine was 57 years old. Sarah, who was then 30 years old and married with children of her own, disclosed to Katherine that she was questioning her own sexual orientation and was struggling with attractions to women that she had been attempting to suppress in her marriage to her husband. Sarah explained that she had been experiencing these feelings for years, but had been terrified to acknowledge them, given her understanding of the family's religious values and her fear of judgment and rejection. Sarah stated that she felt she could no longer maintain the deception, and that she was considering separating from her husband to explore her authentic identity, even though such a choice would likely result in family disapproval and potential estrangement. Katherine's response to Sarah's disclosure was immediate and visceral. Hearing her daughter describe experiences that mirrored Katherine's own suppressed reality created a crisis that Katherine could no longer avoid through her usual strategies of denial and distraction. Katherine recognized that if she encouraged Sarah to maintain her marriage and to suppress her genuine identity, she would be perpetuating the same patterns of concealment and inauthenticity that had characterized Katherine's own life and that had exacted such significant psychological costs. However, Katherine also recognized that if she supported Sarah's decision to live authentically, she would need to confront her own hypocrisy in having maintained concealment for nearly 4 decades, while potentially encouraging her daughter to make different choices. Katherine made a decision in that moment that began a process of significant personal transformation. She disclosed to Sarah for the first time that she herself was a lesbian and that she had been aware of this reality since her own young adulthood but had chosen to suppress it and to build a conventional heterosexual life because she had believed that living authentically would result in family rejection and social ostracism that she could not bear. Katherine explained that she had married Michael not out of romantic attraction but out of fear and conformity to expectations, and that while she did not regret having Sarah and Matthew, she had lived with profound sense of internal disconnection and inauthenticity that had affected her well-being throughout her adult life. The conversation with Sarah initiated a period of intense self-reflection and therapeutic work for Katherine. She began working with a therapist who specialized in sexual orientation and identity issues, exploring the costs of her decades of concealment and considering what authentic living might look like at age 57 after having built an entire adult life around heterosexual presentation. Katherine also began tentatively connecting with LGBTQ communities and resources, encountering for the first time in her life people who shared experiences similar to her own and who offered perspectives on life coming out and on navigating the complex process of transitioning from heterosexual presentation to authentic acknowledgement of lesbian identity. The therapeutic work was difficult and emotionally intense. Katherine grieved the decades she had spent living inauthentically and the experiences she had denied herself through commitment to maintaining an acceptable facade. She struggled with anger toward the religious and cultural systems that had made authentic living feel impossible during her young adulthood and that had contributed to her decision to enter a marriage that was fundamentally dishonest from its inception. She wrestled with questions about whether and how to address her situation with Michael, with Matthew, and with her broader family and community, recognizing that disclosure would require difficult conversations and would potentially result in relationship ruptures she had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Katherine and Sarah developed a much deeper and more authentic relationship following Katherine's disclosure. Sarah proceeded with her own coming-out process, eventually separating from her husband and beginning to build a life that aligned with her genuine identity. Katherine provided support through this transition while also continuing her own therapeutic work. However, Katherine did not immediately take steps to change her own circumstances. She remained married to Michael, continued living in their shared home, and maintained her public presentation as a heterosexual woman, despite having acknowledged to Sarah and to her therapist that this presentation was false. The situation reached a critical point approximately 2 years before the Family Feud taping when Katherine was 60 years old. Sarah confronted Katherine directly about the discrepancy between Katherine's private acknowledgement of her lesbian identity and her continued maintenance of heterosexual presentation in her marriage and in her broader life. Sarah argued that Katherine was modeling continued concealment and fear-based decision-making, and that Katherine's failure to live authentically was affecting not only her own well-being, but also Sarah's process of building her own authentic life. Sarah stated that she needed her mother to demonstrate courage in living honestly if Sarah was to sustain her own commitment to authenticity in the face of family judgment and social difficulty. Katherine recognized the validity of Sarah's challenge, but struggled to overcome the fear and inertia that had characterized her approach to these issues for decades. She continued her therapeutic work and began having more honest conversations with Michael about the distance and disconnection in their marriage, though she did not initially disclose the full truth about her sexual orientation. Michael acknowledged that he recognized problems in their relationship, but stated that he was committed to the marriage and hoped they could address whatever difficulties existed through counseling or renewed effort at connection. Katherine's participation in the Family Feud taping emerged from a suggestion made by her son Matthew, who had applied for his family to appear on the show without knowing about the complicated situation Katherine was managing regarding her identity and her marriage. Matthew had wanted to create an enjoyable shared experience for the family and had invited Katherine, Michael, Sarah, and his own wife to constitute the 5-person team. Katherine had agreed to participate, viewing the experience as potentially providing a distraction from the difficult decisions she was contemplating regarding her marriage and regarding whether to come out publicly as a lesbian after 60 years of concealment. However, as the taping date approached, Katherine began to feel that perhaps the Family Feud appearance could serve a different purpose. She had been working with her therapist on preparing to have more honest conversations with Michael and with Matthew about her sexual orientation and about the fact that her marriage had been based on concealment rather than on genuine romantic attachment. Katherine had not yet found the courage to initiate these conversations through normal private channels. She began to consider whether the public nature of the Family Feud taping might provide external motivation and structure for finally speaking truths she had been unable to articulate through conventional private conversation. Katherine discussed this possibility extensively with her therapist, who expressed concern about using such a public venue for disclosure of information this significant, but who also acknowledged that Katherine had been attempting unsuccessfully for years to find the courage to have these conversations privately, and that perhaps some form of external catalyst might be necessary to overcome the fear and had characterized Katherine's approach to these issues throughout her adult life. Katherine made the decision that if an appropriate moment presented itself during the taping, she would use that opportunity to speak openly about her sexual orientation and about the implications of that reality for her marriage and for her family relationships. The Brennan family arrived at the Family Feud studio on the designated Wednesday morning in October. The group consisted of Katherine, Michael, Sarah, Matthew, and Matthew's wife Jessica. Katherine had slept poorly the previous night, her mind occupied with contemplation of whether she would actually proceed with her tentative plan to use the taping as an opportunity for disclosure and with consideration of the multiple ways such disclosure might affect everyone present. Sarah was aware of her mother's potential intentions and had expressed both support and concern, recognizing that public disclosure would create circumstances that could not be easily managed or controlled. Michael and Matthew remained unaware of the situation, treating the Family Feud appearance as an enjoyable family activity with no understanding of the significance Katherine was attaching to the experience. Their opponents were the Cooper family from Georgia, an enthusiastic and entertaining group who brought considerable energy to their participation. Steve Harvey conducted his standard opening procedures, introducing both families and establishing the light-hearted competitive atmosphere that typically characterized Family Feud recordings. The game began with conventional questions and normal pacing. The first round asked families to name something people hide from their spouse. Katherine felt immediate tension as the question was read, recognizing that it resonated directly with her current circumstances and with the disclosure she was contemplating. Matthew buzzed in for the Brennan family and answered, "Purchases," which appeared on the board as the number 2 response. The family played through the question, providing several acceptable answers. However, when Katherine's turn arrived to contribute an answer, she stated, "Their true self," in a voice that carried obvious emotion and significance beyond typical game show participation. The answer was not on the board, which meant the Brennan family received a strike. However, Steve Harvey noticed something in Katherine's delivery and expression that suggested this was more than a simple incorrect game show answer. Steve paused before moving to the next family member, looking at Katherine with an expression that reflected curiosity and perhaps some level of concern. He asked lightly whether Katherine was speaking from experience, attempting to maintain the playful tone appropriate for the show while also responding to what he had perceived as genuine emotion beneath her response. Katherine met his eyes and nodded slightly but did not elaborate, and the game continued forward. The Brennan family lost that first round, and the Cooper family took control. The game proceeded through several additional rounds with the Brennan family recovering and ultimately winning enough rounds to secure their place in Fast Money. Throughout the game, Katherine appeared increasingly distracted and emotional, though she maintained sufficient composure to continue participating. Sarah watched her mother with evident concern, while Michael and Matthew seemed unaware that anything unusual was occurring beyond normal game show nerves. During a commercial break before the Fast Money round, Steve Harvey approached Katherine directly, His characteristic humor was absent, replaced by genuine interpersonal attentiveness that reflected his recognition that something significant was occurring beneath the surface of conventional game show participation. Steve asked Katherine quietly whether she was all right and whether there was something she needed to address before they continued with the taping. Steve's question created the opening that Katherine had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. Katherine looked at Michael, at Sarah, who nodded encouragement, at Matthew, who appeared confused, and then back at Steve. She stated that there was indeed something she needed to say, but that saying it would likely disrupt the normal flow of the show and would create circumstances that extended beyond typical Family Feud content. Steve responded that if Katherine needed to speak, the show could accommodate whatever she needed to express, and that some moments were more important than game show schedules or conventional programming formats. Katherine took a deep breath and began speaking words that she had rehearsed mentally countless times across many years, but had never actually articulated to her husband or to her son or to any substantial audience beyond her daughter and her therapist. She stated clearly and directly that she was a lesbian and that she had been aware of this fundamental aspect of her identity since her early 20s, but had chosen to conceal it because she had believed that living authentically would result in family rejection and social consequences she could not face. Katherine explained that she had married Michael not because of genuine romantic attraction, but because she had felt compelled to pursue a conventional heterosexual life trajectory that aligned with family and religious expectations, despite knowing that doing so was fundamentally dishonest. The studio fell completely silent. Michael stood motionless, his expression reflecting shock and what appeared to be an attempt to process information that fundamentally contradicted his understanding of their 38-year marriage. Matthew looked between his mother and his father with visible confusion and distress. Sarah moved closer to Katherine in a gesture of physical support. Steve Harvey remained quiet, recognizing that what was unfolding required space and respectful witness rather than entertainment, focused response, or attempts at humor. Katherine continued speaking, needing to complete the disclosure now that she had begun. She acknowledged that her decision to marry Michael while concealing her sexual orientation had been profoundly unfair to him and had deprived him of the opportunity to build a marriage with someone who could offer genuine romantic love rather than dutiful performance of wifely behaviors. She stated that she had come to recognize that continuing to maintain the deception was no longer sustainable, and that she owed Michael the truth even though that truth would cause pain and would disrupt the life they had built together over nearly 4 decades. Katherine then addressed Matthew directly, explaining that her concealment had likewise affected him by creating a family environment based on fundamental dishonesty and by modeling patterns of fear-based living rather than authentic engagement with one's genuine identity. She apologized to Matthew for the confusion and potential hurt her disclosure would cause, while also expressing hope that eventually he might understand that living authentically, even when that authenticity required difficult conversations and significant life changes, represented a more honorable approach than continued concealment. Katherine concluded by explaining that she had chosen to make this disclosure during the Family Feud taping not because she sought public attention or dramatic effect, but because she had been unable for years to find the courage to initiate this conversation through normal private channels, and because she had come to believe that creating external circumstances that would force the conversation might be the only way to record the fear and avoidance that had characterized her approach to these issues her life. When Katherine finished speaking, the silence persisted for several long moments. Steve Harvey was visibly emotional, tears evident in his eyes as he processed what he had just witnessed. He approached Katherine and spoke with genuine compassion, acknowledging the courage required to speak truth that had been concealed for decades, and to do so in circumstances where the response could not be controlled or predicted. Steve stated that while he could not predict how Katherine's disclosure would ultimately affect her family relationships, he recognized that living authentically represented a form of integrity that honored both Katherine herself and the people in relationship with her more fully than continued deception ever could. Steve then turned his attention to Michael, asking gently how Michael was processing what he had just heard. Michael's response reflected the complex mixture of shock, hurt, anger, and confusion that would be expected from someone learning that foundational assumptions about their marriage were false. Michael stated that he felt betrayed and deceived, and that he struggled to understand how Katherine could have maintained such a fundamental lie across 38 years of marriage. He expressed hurt that Katherine had allowed him to believe their marriage was based on genuine romantic connection, when apparently it had been based on Katherine's fear and her commitment to maintaining acceptable social presentation. Steve acknowledged the validity of Michael's feelings, while also noting that the situation was extraordinarily complex and that Michael would need time to process information this significant before being able to fully understand or respond to what Katherine had disclosed. Steve suggested that the family would benefit from professional support in navigating the conversations and decisions that would need to occur following this revelation, and offered to connect them with appropriate therapeutic resources. Steve then asked Sarah about her perspective, and Sarah explained her own coming-out process and her mother's role in supporting that process despite Katherine's continued concealment of her own sexual orientation. Sarah stated that she had challenged her mother to live authentically and that she was proud of Katherine for finally speaking truth, even though doing so was difficult and would create significant disruption in family relationships and life circumstances. Matthew had remained largely silent throughout these exchanges, appearing overwhelmed by what he was learning about his mother and about his parents' marriage. When Steve invited Matthew to speak, he expressed confusion and a need for time to process what he was hearing. Matthew stated that he loved both his parents and that he did not yet understand the full implications of what his mother had disclosed, but that he hoped the family could find ways to navigate the situation with honesty and with preservation of relationships that mattered to everyone involved. Steve made a decision that production would halt entirely for the remainder of the day. He stated clearly that the game show competition was no longer relevant and that what mattered was providing the Brennan family with space and support to begin processing Katherine's disclosure and to make decisions about next steps. Steve directed production staff to provide the family with private space where they could continue their conversation away from cameras and studio audience. He also arranged for the show's producers to connect the family with professional counseling resources specializing in issues related to sexual orientation disclosure, marital transitions, and family relationship dynamics. The Brennan family spent several hours in private conversation following Katherine's disclosure, beginning the difficult process of addressing questions, expressing feelings, and attempting to understand implications of information that had fundamentally altered everyone's understanding of their family history and current circumstances. The conversations were painful and emotional, characterized by expressions of hurt, confusion, anger, and attempts at comprehension of how such significant deception could have been maintained across decades. Michael was particularly devastated, recognizing that his entire adult life had been built on foundations that were false, and that the woman he had believed himself married to for 38 years had been fundamentally different from the person Katherine actually was beneath her maintained presentation. Michael expressed feeling that Katherine had stolen decades of his life by allowing him to remain in a marriage that Katherine had always known was based on her concealment rather than on genuine romantic connection. The betrayal felt comprehensive and created questions about whether their entire marriage had been a lie and whether anything authentic had existed between them. Katherine acknowledged the validity of Michael's feelings, while also attempting to help him understand the complexity of her situation and the genuine fear that had motivated her original decision to enter a heterosexual marriage and to maintain that marriage across decades, despite knowing it was fundamentally dishonest. Katherine emphasized that while she had not felt romantic attraction to Michael, she had experienced genuine care for him and had worked consistently to be a good partner in practical and parental capacities. Even though the marriage lacked the emotional and physical intimacy that should have characterized a truly connected partnership, the family did not achieve resolution during those initial hours of conversation. The wounds were too fresh and the implications too significant for quick processing or easy reconciliation. However, they did establish agreement about several important next steps. Katherine and Michael would separate immediately, with Katherine moving out of their shared home to provide space for both of them to process the situation without the additional complexity of continued cohabitation. They would engage professional legal counsel to address the practical dimensions of dissolving their marriage. They would each pursue individual therapy and would consider participating in joint counseling if and when both felt such joint work might be productive. Matthew needed considerable time and support to process his mother's disclosure and to understand the implications for his understanding of his family history and his parents' relationship. Matthew engaged in individual therapy and eventually participated in family counseling sessions with Katherine that helped him work through his complicated feelings about his mother's concealment and about the life changes that resulted from her disclosure. The decision to air content from the Family Feud taping required extensive deliberation. The production team ultimately decided to air a modified segment that included portions of Katherine's disclosure and the immediate family responses, presented with substantial context about late life coming out, about the challenges facing LGBTQ individuals who came of age during periods when living openly carried significant social and familial costs, and about the complex process of transitioning from closeted existence to authentic living after decades of concealment. The episode was titled, "When Living Honestly Means Losing Everything," and included resource information for LGBTQ individuals considering coming out and for families navigating disclosure of sexual orientation by family members. The episode aired 3 months after the original taping, and the response was immediate and substantial. Thousands of viewers reached out to express that Katherine's story resonated with their own experiences of late life coming out, or with experiences of family members who had concealed their sexual orientation across decades. LGBTQ advocacy organizations praised Katherine's courage, while also using her story to illustrate the ongoing need for social and familial acceptance that would make early life authentic living feasible rather than forcing individuals to choose between authentic identity and family connection. The episode generated significant discussion about the ethics of Katherine's choices and about whether her decision to marry Michael while concealing her sexual orientation constituted a form of betrayal that justified his hurt and anger. Some viewers expressed sympathy for Katherine and recognition of the difficult circumstances she had faced during her young adulthood when she made the original decision to pursue heterosexual marriage. Others argued that Katherine's extended deception had been fundamentally unfair to Michael and had deprived him of decades of potential authentic partnership with someone who could offer genuine romantic love. Katherine herself became an unexpected voice in conversations about late life coming out and about the costs of extended concealment. She participated in interviews and spoke at LGBTQ community events, consistently acknowledging the harm her choices had caused to Michael while also helping people understand the complex factors that contributed to her original decision and to her maintenance of concealment across decades. Katherine emphasized that while she understood others might judge her choices harshly, living authentically at age 60 too felt essential to her well-being and to her capacity to model honest living for her children and grandchildren. Katherine and Michael's marriage ended in divorce approximately 1 year after Katherine's disclosure. The process was painful and complicated by the need to address not only practical and financial matters, but also the deep emotional wounds created by Katherine's extended deception. Michael struggled with anger and grief for several years following the divorce, working through complicated feelings about having been deceived across the majority of his adult life and about needing to rebuild his understanding of himself and his life history in light of information that fundamentally contradicted previous narratives. Katherine began building an authentic life as an openly lesbian woman for the first time at age 62. She connected with LGBTQ community organizations and support groups for older adults who had come out late in life. She eventually entered into her first romantic relationship with a woman, experiencing for the first time the kind of genuine romantic and physical connection she had denied herself throughout her adult life. Katherine reported that living authentically created profound sense of relief and integration that she had never experienced during the decades when she had been maintaining heterosexual presentation. The relationship between Katherine and her children evolved over the years following her disclosure. Sarah and Katherine maintained close connection, with Sarah expressing consistent support for her mother's decision to finally live authentically despite the costs involved. Matthew's process of working through his feelings about his mother's disclosure was more extended and more complicated. He struggled with anger about the deception and with grief about the loss of his understanding of his family history and his parents' marriage. However, through therapeutic work and through Katherine's consistent willingness to acknowledge the harm caused by her choices, while also explaining the circumstances that had contributed to those choices, Matthew eventually achieved a form of reconciliation with Katherine that allowed them to maintain relationship even though trust damaged by decades of concealment required considerable time to rebuild. 5 years after the Family Feud episode aired, Katherine was 67 years old and living a life that finally aligned with her genuine identity. She had maintained her real estate career, having decided that continuing professional work provided valuable structure and purpose, even though she had reached normal retirement age. She had developed strong connections within LGBTQ communities and had become an advocate for older adults considering late life coming out. She maintained regular contact with both Sarah and Matthew and had developed relationships with her grandchildren that were characterized by honesty and authenticity rather than by the careful concealment that had defined her own approach to family relationships during earlier periods of her life. Michael had likewise moved forward with his life, though the process of recovery from the betrayal he experienced required extensive therapeutic work and considerable time. He eventually entered into a new relationship with a woman who offered the kind of genuine romantic connection that his marriage to Katherine had never provided. Michael reported that while he continued to experience hurt and anger regarding Katherine's deception, he had achieved sufficient healing that he could acknowledge the complexity of her situation and could recognize that her original decision to enter a heterosexual marriage had been motivated by genuine fear rather than by intentional cruelty or indifference to his well-being. The broader cultural impact of Katherine's story continued through conversations about sexual orientation, authenticity, and the costs of social and familial rejection that lead individuals to conceal fundamental aspects of their identity. The episode became a teaching tool in therapeutic training programs addressing issues related to sexual orientation and identity, in LGBTQ advocacy organizations working to create more accepting social environments that would reduce the incidence of closeted living, and in faith communities attempting to reconcile religious teachings with more compassionate and affirming approaches to LGBTQ members. 10 years after that October afternoon when Katherine Brennan disclosed her sexual orientation during the Family Feud taping, the episode remained significant as a documentary of one woman's journey from decades of concealment to eventual authentic living, and as an illustration of both the courage required to speak such truth and the costs created by extended deception. Katherine reflected frequently on her decision to use the Family Feud taping as the catalyst for disclosure, acknowledging that the choice had been imperfect and had created complications that might have been avoided through more conventional private conversation. However, Katherine maintained that given her inability across many years to initiate such conversation through normal channels, the public disclosure had been necessary to overcome the fear and avoidance patterns that had characterized her approach to these issues throughout her adult life. The relationship between authenticity and relational integrity remained central to Katherine's understanding of her experience and to the message she shared with others considering whether to disclose concealed aspects of identity. Katherine emphasized consistently that, while living authentically required courage and often resulted in significant disruption of established patterns and relationships, The alternative of continued concealment ultimately served no one well and created forms of disconnection and inauthenticity that affected not only the individual maintaining concealment, but also all the relationships that individual inhabited. If this narrative has demonstrated the profound courage required to speak truths that have been concealed across decades, and has illustrated why authentic living, even when it requires difficult conversations and significant life changes, ultimately serves individual well-being and relational integrity more effectively than continued concealment, please take a moment to support this channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to receive future content. Consider sharing this story with individuals who might benefit from understanding that personal authenticity, while often requiring painful acknowledgement of past choices, and while potentially disrupting established relationships and life circumstances, represents an essential foundation for genuine well-being and for relationships based on honest knowledge of who people actually are rather than on carefully maintained presentations that obscure authentic identity. Katherine Brennan's courage in finally speaking truth after 62 years of concealment demonstrated that it is never too late to choose authentic living, and that the costs of such honesty, while real and sometimes substantial, are ultimately preferable to the ongoing psychological burden of maintaining fundamental deception across one's entire adult life. The story proves that human beings possess remarkable capacity for both maintaining deception when fear or social pressure makes authentic living seem impossible, and for eventually finding courage to speak truth when continued concealment becomes unsustainable. Steve Harvey's emotional response to Katherine's disclosure and his recognition that some moments transcend entertainment and demand respectful witness rather than deflection or minimization demonstrated why creating space for difficult truths to be spoken and acknowledged represents one of the most significant gifts that individuals and institutions can offer to people navigating complex identity issues and relationship challenges. That lesson, revealed during an unexpected moment of disclosure on a game show stage and honored through production decisions that prioritized human dignity over conventional entertainment format, continues to inform cultural conversations about authenticity, about the costs of concealment, and about the transformative power of finally living in alignment with one's genuine identity regardless of how long such alignment has been deferred.